Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of the Brewery, I will be discussing a new commander previewed from Throne of Eldraine, Grumgully the Generous. Grumgully is a legendary 3/3 Goblin Shaman that costs 1 generic, 1 red, and 1 green, thus passing the vanilla test. It has each other non-human creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it, which is a great ability to have in the command zone. Its variability means that you can use Grumgully as the commander for many kinds of decks. You can use it as the commander of a red-green goblin tribal deck and add a bunch of goblins that create goblin tokens when they enter the battlefield, and goblin lords like both Virtues of Krenko and Wart the Raid Mother. This can allow for a lot of dangerous interactions since your goblins are going to enter the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter. So not only will you create a huge horde of goblins, but they're all the more dangerous. You can also build a semi-competitive EDH deck with Grumgully at the helm and a bunch of cantrips, looting spells, wheels, etc. in order to dig through the deck to find the combo pieces needed to go infinite with Persist creatures as well as running the red counter spells to protect said combo. Since Grumgully gives those Persist creatures a +1/+1 counter when they enter the battlefield, you can essentially have infinite triggers for many things with just 3 cards in play: a free sacrifice outlet, a creature with Persist, and Grumgully. You can even use Grumgully as the sleeper commander in a janky Hydra tribal deck since it's relatively unassuming. In short, Grumgully is a very versatile commander, and this deck tech will by no means be the definitive way to brew with Grumgully. I'm simply showcasing an in-depth card-by-card explanation of how I personally brewed Grumgully, which is in this case a mid-range deck. When I first saw Grumgully, I immediately thought about creature tokens and creatures that create creature tokens when entering the battlefield, specifically non-human creatures. Avenger of Zendikar, Deep Forest Hermit, Deranged Hermit, and Crested Herdcaller all create creature tokens when entering the battlefield. With Grumgully in play, these creatures as well as the tokens they create all enter the battlefield with the +1/+1 counter. Grumgully essentially amplifies the value of such creatures since it makes Crested Herdcaller a way to add 8 trample damage on the board for just 5 mana. These aren't the only token generators in the deck either. Dragonlair Spider creates a 1/1 green insect creature token whenever an opponent casts a spell. This card is crazy in multiplayer Commander, especially since those insects are going to be 2/2 thanks to Grumgully. Tendershoot Dryad creates a 1/1 green Saproling creature token each upkeep and pumps all Saprolings you control when you get the City's Blessing, meaning that with Grumgully in play, you could potentially be creating a 4/4 every upkeep. There's also a slight landfall theme in the deck when it comes to creating creature tokens. Omnath Locus of Rage, Rampaging Bailiffs, and Sporemound each create a creature token whenever land enters the battlefield under our control. Since the deck runs ramp spells and fetch lands, these triggers add up and can fill the board quite quickly with huge threats. Kazul, Tyrant of the Cliffs, and Nakatl Warpride are potentially the most dangerous of the token creators. Unless an attacker pays 3 for each creature attacking us, Kazul creates a 3/3 red ogre creature token that Grumgully makes 4/4. Nakatl Warpride creates a copy of itself for each creature defending player controls. Those tokens are going to be 4/4 with Grumgully in play. Then the defending player must block each of those creatures with at least 1 creature if able. This can potentially help kill utility creatures the defending player might have. While on the topic of creature tokens, the deck naturally contains Parallel Lives and Doubling Season. Doubling Season in particular is the best effect I'll be mentioning since it also doubles the counters placed on creatures and planeswalkers. Other counter doubling effects in the deck include Colonian Hydra, which doubles the amount of +1/+1 counters on our creatures when it attacks. Hardened Scales and Pure Imaginative Rascal each add an additional +1/+1 counter that will be placed on a creature. Of noting is that Pure, similarly to Doubling Season, will also do the same with loyalty counters on planeswalkers. Proliferate is also another way to place an additional +1/+1 counter on creatures and loyalty counters on planeswalkers. Thus, the deck contains Karn's Bastion and Evolution Sage. Karn's Bastion will proliferate for 4 mana and tapping, while Evolution Sage proliferates via landfall. Since the deck does have some support for landfall, it can trigger quite often, making creatures too overwhelming to deal with beyond a board wipe of some kind. Although there's support for planeswalkers, these circumstances are just happenstance. Doubling Season, Per, and Proliferate work with any counter, so their inclusion is more so for the creatures in the deck. However, the deck does run 3 planeswalkers and they no doubt benefit from these effects. Garruk Primal Hunter, Freyalise Llanowar's Fury, and Nissa Voice of Zendikar. Each of their abilities are relevant, so let's talk a bit more in detail about them. Garruk creates a 3/3 beast creature token with its first ability, a beast that can enter as a 4/4 thanks to Grumgully. His second ability is incredibly useful in the deck since we can draw as many cards as the power of our strongest creature. His ultimate is not the main reason for running him, but if you're able to achieve it without losing Garruk, you're creating an obscene amount of fatties with it. Freyalise creates a 1/1 elf druid that's basically a proxy of Llanowar elves. So she's giving us mana acceleration that, with Grumgully in play, is a 2/2. Her second ability is useful in getting rid of essential or annoying artifacts or enchantments. Her ultimate is amazing for filling our hands with cards thanks to all the green creatures we'll no doubt have in play. Her last ability is the only one irrelevant in the deck since she's not being used as the commander. Nissa's first ability provides a 0/1 plant creature token that is 1/2 with Grumgully in play. Her second ability can be used to fatten our creatures even more since it gives each of them a +1/+1 counter. Her ultimate is similar to Freyalise's, but it draws us for the amount of lands we control as well as gaining us the same amount of life. Notice how all these planeswalkers have an ability that creates a way to protect themselves and also have an ability that draws us cards. These planeswalkers are definitely pulling their weight in this deck. I've also been mentioning landfall a couple of times, so let's see in greater detail how this theme is supported in the deck. Besides triggering landfall, it's just important to try and have as many lands as possible in order to effectively cast some of the spells in the deck, which can have a steep casting cost. Apart from the 8 fetch lands the deck is running, it also includes classic ramp spells like Cultivate, Kodama's Reach, Farseek, Nature's Lore, and 3 Visits. Some of these spells can also be used to put Dryad Arbor into play. With Grumgully in play, it enters with a +1/+1 counter on it. Notwithstanding, the fetches can be cracked at instant speed to get it into play as an out-of-nowhere blocker in a pinch. Quite possibly the best land for landfall is Ghost Town. You can return it to your hand for free during an opponent's turn, and then play it during your next turn in order to guarantee a landfall trigger during each of your turns. This deck also includes ways to play multiple lands in our turn, like Azusa Lost But Seeking, Mina Undead Wildborn, Oracle of Moldiah, and Exploration. What's important to keep in mind is that these permanents don't just allow us to play multiple lands from our hand. If we have Crucible of Worlds or Ramunap Excavator in play, we can also play lands from our graveyard. With these cards in play, it's very hard to miss at least one landfall trigger per turn. You can also use oppressive lands quite effectively with this strategy. I include them because my pod doesn't mind land destruction, but that may not be the case with your own playgroup. Those lands I'm referring to are Wasteland, Strip Mine, and Ghost Quarter. If you're able to consistently recur these lands from the graveyard multiple times in a turn, you're essentially clearing opponents' boards of lands until it reaches a point where they can't play lands. Since the deck is 2-colored, you can include these without worrying about getting color screwed. Again, caution when running them depending on your play environment. Now that I mentioned color screw, Prismatic Omen is included in the deck in order to get the most out of our lands, especially the fetch lands. For really grindy games, maybe you don't have the luxury to lose life to lands, or maybe there's just nothing left to fetch. This enchantment lets you tap those lands for mana at least. Since we can play lands from our graveyard, in case your graveyard were to be exiled to deprive you of playing your lands from it, Elixir of Immortality is a good way to protect our graveyard. Even though this deck isn't graveyard dependent, Elixir of Immortality is just an overall good card to include in an EDH deck. Alright, so with all this mana we're going to need spells to cast. If we cast everything in our hand, it'll be a trifle difficult to continue the game without things to play or responses to use. So, in order to not run out of steam, the deck runs ways of drawing cards besides the previously mentioned planeswalkers. Hazoret's Monument not only helps our red creatures cost 1 generic less, but when we cast a creature spell, we can loot 1 when we do. Beast Whisperer, Primordial Sage, and Zendikar Resurgent just straight up draw us a card when we cast a creature spell, whereas Guardian Project draws us a card whenever a non-token creature enters our battlefield. Keeper of Fables and Oran Frostfang draw us cards whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player. With the amount of creatures we're creating and playing, we can no doubt take advantage of those abilities. With Sylvan Library and enough life, we can potentially draw 3 cards during each of our draw steps. Greater Good allows us to sacrifice a creature for free in order to draw cards for its power and then discard 3 cards. With no shortage of beefy creatures, this allows us to loot quite a bit into the deck. And if we draw into too many lands, those can be the 3 cards we discard and then play them from the graveyard as mentioned earlier. The deck is mid-range, but it doesn't just win by having a bunch of creatures in play with Anger in the graveyard for a hasty Alpha Strike, or by having Craterhoof Behemoth enter the battlefield with a board full of creatures. Grumgully places a +1/+1 counter on any non-human creature we have enter the battlefield, for free. That means that creatures with Persist can die and indefinitely return to the battlefield. Therefore, you can go infinite with a free sacrifice outlet, a creature with Persist, and Grumgully in play. I do explain this strategy in great detail in my Mazarek Kraul Death Priest video, which you can find a link for above. In that video, I explain how those interactions occur in the stack and how to place them in the stack for optimized benefits. So, for a more in-depth explanation as how Persist interacts with triggers on the stack, I suggest taking a look at that video. But, since Grumgully's ability is a replacement effect and not a triggered effect, I don't have to explain the stack as much as I did with Mazarek's ability. So, let's see how it happens here. Assuming we have a creature like Eerie Oofs in play, along with a free sacrifice outlet like Altar of Dementia, which will also function as a wincon in this example, and Grumgully. Simply sacrifice Eerie Oofs to Altar of Dementia, which will mill target player for Eerie Oofs power. Eerie Oofs Persist trigger resolves, and then it returns to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it, simultaneously with Grumgully's +1/+1 counter. These counters cancel each other out. Since Eerie Oofs no longer has a +1/+1 counter on it, you can proceed to do this as many times as necessary to mill out every opponent. Eerie Oofs isn't the only creature with Persist in the deck. I'm also running Woodfall Primus, which has the added bonus of wiping opponents' boards of all non-creature permanents, as well as Lesser Masticore, Scuzzback Marauders, and Thunderblust, which are just included for having Persist. Other free sacrifice outlets included that can also be abused are Ashnod's Altar, Phyrexian Altar, and the previously mentioned Greater Good. But creatures with Persist aren't only abused with these effects. They're also immortal sacrifice fodder to cards like Eldrazi Monument, as well as being the perfect blocker since they essentially never go away. Before moving forward, Altar of Dementia isn't the only wincon via this infinite combo. In fact, it shouldn't be in case an opponent has ways of winning via decking or is incapable of being decked because of effects of cards that get shuffled back into their library. That's why I'm also running Purphoros God of the Forge and Impact Tremors. With the infinite enter the battlefield triggers, you should secure the win. Although mid-range, this deck isn't built with a battlecruiser mentality. You have to be able to take care of threats on the table. Apart from the already mentioned cards for removal effects, the deck is also running Terrastodon, Beast Within, Force of Vigor, Decimate, and Vandal Blast. Additional to those, the deck's also running Thorn Mammoth. Every time a creature and/or token enters the battlefield, it can fight a creature an opponent controls. With a card like Eldrazi Monument in play, you could basically fight anything and survive. To round out the deck, the rest of the lands are Ancient Tomb, Cinderglade, Command Tower, Spire Garden, Stomping Ground, Taiga, Temple of the False God, and 8 of each basic snow land in case opponents are running anything that benefit us for it. If Taiga is out of the question, just substitute it with a check land or pain land and you should still be good to go. The deck also runs Soul Ring to help boost the mana base. You could run Mana Crypt instead, but the deck doesn't have many ways to gain life, so running it is a bit risky, especially with Ancient Tomb and all the fetch lands. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Grumgully the Generous. Since Grumgully was just spoiled the day before yesterday, there might be new cards released in Throne of Eldraine that would make this deck even more consistent. But as far as previews go, this is definitely a fun commander to build around. As mentioned in the beginning of this video, there are a bunch of different ways you can brew around this commander. You can go Hydra Tribal, you can go Goblin Tribal, just many different ways. As far as my own spicy brew, you can find my current deck list for this commander down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.